Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. Today we continue our series on the future, and we're going to have a conversation about the future of this planet Earth, our island home. We're honored to have with us for this conversation the Right Reverend Katharine Jefferts Schori, who was Presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church from 2006 to 2015. And here to introduce her is her current colleague, Bishop Dean Wolfe, our rector.
Well, we're delighted to have Katharine here. She is, I tell people that one of the great privileges of my ministry was serving as Vice President of the House of Bishops with Katharine. She has a passion for the environment. As you may know, she has a PhD in oceanography. Do I have that right? Mm-hmm. And has studied seriously the issues that affect our planet. She served as the presiding bishop in a time of great, what should we say, great tumult, and had a wonderful way of calming troubled waters. So, Katharine, it's great to have you back at St. Bart's. I know when you were presiding bishop, you would come over here sometimes for worship.
Thank you. It's a joy to be with you.
I think we're ready to begin, Katharine.
All right, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to speak for 15 or 20 minutes, and then I think it will be open for questions for those who are curious. Many of you remember Superstorm Sandy. I was at an Anglican communion meeting then in New Zealand, and we were horrified by news of the destruction, including flooding a dozen blocks south of St. Bart's. Hurricanes have struck the Atlantic coast for eons, but our actions are increasing their strength and destructiveness. Our planet is changing. Its life-giving systems are struggling, and none of it bodes well for Earth's future. Changing climate, intensifying weather events, and planetary pollution are the direct result of human activity here and around the globe. Our baptismal promises include taking responsibility for the suffering, injustice, and death we are causing, things done and things left undone. Seeking and serving Christ in all persons and loving our neighbors as ourselves means respecting human dignity and ultimately the dignity of all creation. The vocation that God gives us in Genesis 1 is to be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over every living thing. Being fruitful means acting as God does, being creative. Having dominion is not domination. Both of those words come from the root for house. Having dominion is about husbanding and housekeeping, caring for our planetary home and household. God also tells the sea monsters and birds to be fruitful and multiply. All living things reflect God's creativity. In the second chapter of Genesis, God sets humanity in a garden and names our vocation to till and keep that garden. It's creative work, helping the earth produce abundance, so all creatures and creation itself might flourish. God set us here to live in creative relationship with one another in a community that reaches far beyond our human neighbors, a community that only thrives when its members are healthy and living into their own particular vocations. The earth itself is created to nurture seeds that will eventually bear fruit if they're well tended. That tending largely comes from the planet's life-giving systems, seasons of rain and sunshine in life-giving amounts, and creative recycling of dead matter in the soil. Sometimes it's aided by human hands. Yet human action is undoing and endangering Earth's life-giving systems. The living things on this planet are all capable of creativity, even the ones we love to hate. Viruses and mosquitoes are part of the ongoing creativity of evolution, whether we think of them as pests or fearful threats. We wouldn't be here without their challenge. If we destroy one kind of creature on this planet, God's creative intention means another will soon take its place. Yet we can learn to live creatively with them, as we've learned to do with polio, measles, or plant pests. We're learning how to live with this new coronavirus, perhaps not learning very well. We're also beginning to learn how to live creatively with rising seas and warming temperatures. Yet even with decisive action, we are moving into a future vastly unlike what our grandparents knew. And those disappearing species are not ever coming back. Our human vocation is to tend and encourage the whole garden toward creativity. That vocation includes moral leadership, how we incarnate our baptismal vocation to reconcile, heal, and love all our neighbors as we seek God's dream now and in God's unfolding future. Moral leadership proclaims God's dream in word and deed, living creatively in community. The creativity of a city or a community depends on naming and tending the needs, gifts, and aspirations of all its members. People of every sort and condition, trees that give shade and oxygen and clean the air, healthy living conditions and care for all life forms, fostering our own creative vocations, ensuring clean water for human beings, fish, and frogs. In the Bible, Zechariah describes a holy city as one where old people can sit in peace, watching over streets full of playing children. Elders and youngsters can't thrive where there is no health, and we're certainly seeing the dire results of that in this pandemic. Our challenge is about right behavior and encouraging others to choose right and healing paths. Adam and Eve were challenged to cherish the garden and its creatures and to help each one live its particular creative vocation. The hard part of gardening is recognizing the particular dignity of every single creature, not just an obnoxiously aggressive driver or a noisy nighttime neighbor, but birds and trees, as well as snakes and wasps, weeds and so-called pests. We may find some of our fellow garden dwellers inconvenient, yet each one plays a vital part in creation. Most creatures in the planetary garden follow their God-given vocations without having to choose. Human beings choose for good or ill, often unwittingly, and every occasion has expanding and often irreversible consequences. That's what Paul is getting at when he writes, "The wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ." Choosing how we relate to other inhabitants of the garden can be abundantly creative or deadly, and we're reaping the consequences of a long series of poor and destructive choices, sometimes downright evil ones. Loving and caring for the garden require restraint, not exterminating all the pests, not just planting monocultures, not harvesting every last plant or seed in the field. Remember that prophetic charge to leave the edges of the field for the poor? Right human choices cooperate or harmonize with the garden's possibilities, rather than blindly eliminating creatures we think are undesirable. God's dream of perfection is always more diverse and surprising than our human imagination, and it's definitely not a monoculture. Wise farmers know that planting the same crop in a field year after year quickly requires far more pesticide, herbicide, and manure than rotating the crop. And one answer is to let the land rest periodically so that it can recreate. Fallowing and Sabbath rest are part of God's covenant with creation. God, who created, judged it all very good and rested on the seventh day. In a fallow field, recreative rest means a polyculture of diverse plants and so-called weeds that actually help refresh and recreate the soil. Human societies have the same challenge. The diversity of human community and the diverse gifts in each person are essential to human flourishing. We have a tragic history of judging some as better or less than others, usually based on external characteristics. We human beings have categorized skin color, language, gender, age, education, skills, along a supposed ladder of perfection, a ladder that's usually designed to privilege those who are in charge. Jacob's ladder dreams of blessing for all humanity. The biblical tradition undergirds moral leadership, and it shares attitudes about right behavior with the other great religious traditions. Treat others as you want to be treated. The challenge is always about who counts. Mr. Rogers taught us it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood when we begin to see the creative, life-giving potential in everyone around us. That's how God relates to creation, abiding with us and in us as neighbor, closer than our breath or clothing. Can we see creative, life-giving potential in snake and rabbit, orca and jellyfish, yeast and mold, even fire, hurricane, and virus? We may admire or fear different parts of creation, yet we can respect the dignity of stinging jellyfish and spreading viruses by acknowledging their particular challenges and acting accordingly. Wearing a wetsuit or not swimming when the Portuguese man of war are present, or wearing a mask and seeking a vaccine when a new virus is making the global rounds. Each species has creative work to do, and part of the current virulence of those two creatures is the wages of human changes to this planet. Eden's errors continue. Human beings still think we're masters of the garden, able to dominate and control the garden's creativity, to exploit plants, animals, or other human beings with similarly destructive results. Our mutual flourishing depends on serving the whole created community, human and otherwise. A fruitful garden grows in the greening presence of divine creativity, but ultimately dies in the face of attempts at supremacy. Moral leadership requires truth-telling. Prophets begin with lament or complaining about injustice if right paths aren't being followed. Nothing changes until the truth comes out, which makes truth-tellers unpopular. And as Garrison Keillor used to say, you don't want one at your birthday party. Right speech names injustice, suffering, destruction, and evil. And true prophets go on to paint a vision of a healed, life-giving future. They tell the truth of what's possible in God's garden. Truth-tellers tell it like it is. They tell us what could be, and they give us hope that the dream will be realized. It's the creative, life-giving Word of God in action. Truth-telling's key to healing our environmental crisis, to racial reconciliation, and to this pandemic. Truth-telling acknowledges our own sin or selfishness, and it equally affirms our creative capacity to dream and work toward more abundant life. But it means fearless confession, naming both our lapses and our hopes, personally and in community. We have personal restoration to seek, and we have healing work to do in community. If this reminds you of Alcoholics Anonymous, you're onto something. Our plight is the result of thoughtless, addictive consumption, which is what 12-step spirituality is all about. It's a practical way of healing that's possible when we acknowledge both fault and faithful hope on the right road of love. Most of us already know what the central problems are. a warming climate, and acidifying oceans caused by greenhouse gases, and the exponential growth in other pollutants like nutrient runoff from agriculture and sewage, plastics everywhere across the planet. Last year, a scientist measured 10,000 particles of plastic in a quart of Arctic snow. Excess pharmaceuticals and industrial toxins in almost every part of the food chain. These pollutions are signs of our addiction to consumption, which our grandparents called the wasting disease when they meant tuberculosis, but it means today the wasting of creation. Species extinction rates right now are the highest since the Great Permian extinction more than 250 million years ago, when 96% of marine life and 70% of life on land disappeared as magma, volcanism, ignited coal and oil deposits, which also eventually acidified the oceans. Today, it's human activity, not volcanic activity, that's destroying the life-giving creative capacity of this fragile earth, our island home. This blue marble has a distinct smoke ring, choking the life out of creation. We have only a decade to turn the global furnace down, to slow the melting, and yield a climate that might still be reasonably hospitable to human life. Yet there is abundant hope, particularly among the young prophets who can see through their elders' smoke screens to what's on the horizon. The Greta Thunbergs of this age are telling the truth about the legacy we're leaving their generation. The Gretas are like David taking on Goliath, or Esther confronting Haman. And in the Bible, the little ones frequently prevail. There's hope among indigenous peoples whose traditions honor, respect, and care for all relatives in the sacred hoop of life. First Peoples are telling the truth and seeking healing. We who are less connected to the earth have much to learn from them, theologically and ecologically. There's hope in household accounting. Examine your garbage. What could be composted, recycled, reused, repurposed, and in this season, regifted or not purchased in the first place? Eat lower on the food chain. Animal agriculture produces almost 1/5 of the planet's emissions. Plants don't. Do an energy audit. Explore solar panels, solar water heating, heat pumps, and renewable energy, especially for transportation. The Episcopal Church's carbon tracker offers down-to-earth help and accountability. And I would note that New York is hardly represented in this scheme. There's lots of room for growth. There's also hope among scientists and technologists working to shift energy systems towards sustainable sources. There's hope in shifting to more sustainable agriculture, hope in more local food sources, and cities that foster food forests rather than food deserts. There's hope in rain gardens and permeable roadways that help recharge aquifers instead of sending excess nutrients downstream into dead zones. We have opportunities in the larger community as well. This election cycle has highlighted our responsibility to reconcile with neighbors if we're going to impact the environmental crisis, racial reconciliation, and the suffering of this pandemic. The solutions begin with individuals and local communities, even as we need massive global responses. Project Drawdown points to those larger actions, and one of the highest priorities is restoring and maintaining bogs, swamps, and marshes, which not only keep greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, but expand the ability of those living communities to sequester even more carbon. New York has a treasure in tidal wetlands, particularly around Long Island and Manhattan and along the Hudson River. Moral leadership requires taking a fearless moral inventory and fearlessly dreaming God's intended future for the entire garden. Dreaming includes getting down and dirty, doing the tilling and keeping work that respects the dignity of God's creation. I'd encourage you to go boldly into God's future, seeking an abundant harvest for all creatures, for that banquet on the holy mountainside, a banquet of rich foods and well-aged, appropriately attractive beverages for every single creature on this planet.
Thank you so much, Bishop Jefferts Schori, for that comprehensive and inspiring presentation. I encourage those of you who are watching who may have questions for Bishop Jefferts Schori to use the live chat function on YouTube, to use the comments function on Facebook, or you can simply email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. Bishop, you talk about the 10 years we have to make important changes, and can we do that in 10 years? And that's an intimidating timeline given how slow we've been to make changes so far, and how reluctant, particularly in the American context, we've been to make significant change.
Well, yes, I think we can. I'm struck particularly by the shift in electrification for transportation. The sale of electric cars is a piece of that. The shift in many power companies to renewable energy. Nevada, where I live, is an example. Massive solar installations and a commitment to shift the electrical system in this part of the country to renewable energy rather than fossil fuels. That's happening all over the place. Elections have a lot to do with the possibility of moving in this direction in the next decade, and I think we're hopeful. And I think people from both sides of the political divide are beginning to understand that it affects all of us, and if we don't change, the future is going to look pretty grim.
Katharine, one of the things that the presiding bishop's office allows you to do is travel around the country and around the world. You gave us some things that have made you hopeful. Could you talk a little bit about something that you've seen that you just went, wow, what a great idea, or that's really encouraging?
Certainly. I see people everywhere planting gardens, and it's happened intensely during this pandemic, producing food locally, which reduces greenhouse emissions, improves the soil, which is another way of sequestering additional carbon. I think about places I visited in various parts of Africa, in Ghana, for example, where ERD, Episcopal Relief and Development, does a lot of creative work, improving soils, improving the ability of local people to farm effectively, water stewardship in many places, and indeed, people who live in more rural contexts I think have a greater sense of how important this work is.
Yeah. Thanks.
You mentioned COVID-19 a few times, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what this current acute crisis we're living through has taught us about the larger crisis of our planet.
Well, for one thing, that we're all connected, and what each person does has an impact on everybody else. I think that's been the biggest struggle. We like to consider ourselves as individuals, but we don't live without the blessing and the creative work of the people around us. Right. And the people who are dying in this pandemic are showing that to us in very grim ways.
Is there a connection? I hear people talking about a connection between the environment and pandemics. Is there a line there to be drawn?
Absolutely. A piece of it is the desire for people in most parts of the world to eat more meat, and the way we tend our livestock across the world, excess crowding, antibiotics to an excess, the way we fatten cattle for market in feedlots, all of that contributes to the evolution of more virulent bacteria and viruses. The wet markets in many parts of the world where bushmeat or wild animals are brought to market and held in close captivity is a distribution opportunity for viruses and bacteria and diseases. How we eat impacts the diseases that we get.
Yeah.
You encouraged us to step away from thinking of human beings as the center of everything. I'm wondering what strategies you might suggest for combating anthropocentrism.
Well, I think getting outside and delighting in the world that God has created. The sun is just coming up here in Nevada. The birds are moving, flying. I can see out the window some of the wonderful local fauna. Get out and see and wonder, give thanks for the creatures that are around us. Don't live your life cooped up in your room.
What about in our thinking about God and our thinking about our own religious tradition? Because of course, God giving Adam dominion over the garden has been often used to support a kind of human-centered way of thinking.
It's a charge to be responsible rather than to control, and I think that's been the theme for ever, beginning with the Hebrew people, but we've interpreted it in selfish ways, saying that it's there for our taking rather than for our stewardship.
What are passages of scripture that most inform your thinking about the planet?
I think careful reading of those first couple of chapters of Genesis are absolutely essential. Job, read Job. And I think the Gospels are filled with Jesus traveling across the Middle East, and they're very focused on the local context. The storms on the lake, fishing. Jesus and his disciples lived close to the land. When you read much of the Hebrew scriptures, it's about how people are farming, how they're tending livestock, how they're relating to their neighbors, and it's very local. When we can pay closer attention to what's happening in the created world around us, I think we have a much greater possibility to be good stewards.
It seems that interconnectedness is a huge part of this, and I always think that the church community has a role to play in that. What kinds of things do you see happening that we might be looking to do?
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to say something about civil discourse is because our congregations are diverse, and being able to honor the gifts of people across the political spectrum, across the theological spectrum, gives us a sense of how we might relate to the non-human creation. Our country is so divided right now. We've got immense healing work to do and honoring work to do and discovering to do among the people in our congregations. And that's a great place to start.
I again encourage those of you who have questions for Bishop Jefferts Schori to send them in using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. We have a question about the Green New Deal and the role faith communities can play in political and legislative solutions to climate issues, and why something like the Green New Deal has been seen so much in such a partisan lens.
Why it's been seen in such a partisan lens, yes. Well, this has been a highly political and politicized season. My sense is that congregations have a real opportunity to pay attention to their local context and how addressing the major crises of our lives around the world right now, the pandemic, the environmental situation, when we can do that more effectively and draw from our local context. Some congregations decide to steward a watershed, the water courses in their parochial territory. I wonder how many people who belong to the congregation called St. Bart's know where the water courses originally were on Manhattan Island. There's been some great work on that. I know there's a map that shows some of that awareness. What is it like when you know where the water that comes off the roof at St. Bart's goes when it hits the pavement? And how the garbage that's on the sidewalk or in the street, how that impacts the East River or the Hudson. What you do at St. Bart's has a significant impact on the health of the waterways around Manhattan. How can you begin to do that kind of work in every congregation in the church, to claim something that you can do very locally that has a much larger impact on the world, on the health of the planet?
We're always happy when the water isn't coming in through the roof.
Yes, I've seen the evidence of that. Oh.
It's a helpful way of I think thinking about it. I know I often will think, well, what can one person do? What can I do? Gee, we're not in a forest or on a meadow. We're in Midtown Manhattan, and nature feels far from us. But of course, the Hudson and the East River aren't so far away.
Mm-hmm. And every action makes a difference, even the smallest ones. I'll tell a bad story on myself. I was walking in Manhattan several years ago, and I watched a guy drop his cigarette butt. And I said, sir, you've dropped something. You've dropped something. And he looks around and he just, he got irritated, but he at least paid attention to the fact that he had thoughtlessly discarded something that had the capacity to damage other members of creation. The Episcopal Church's carbon tracker has a very helpful structure to it that can aid somebody in looking at how individual decisions make a significant difference in the world around us. Light bulbs, we know a lot of this, composting, how we drive, how we travel, what we eat. And what we eat is probably the biggest piece of how we can change change our carbon output in our households.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question about the economy and balancing economic interests with with climate interests, and if you can talk about making those trade-offs and decisions.
Sure. Economy comes from the Greek word for house, oikos, and ecology comes from exactly the same roots. Our household economy and our household care, ecological stewardship, means that they have to talk to each other all the time. Americans, I think, and American politics often privileges economics, profit, particularly the profit motive, but ultimately the flourishing of a community depends on effective use of the resources that God has given us. And that's both an economic and an ecological question in search of a solution.
You drew our attention to the Episcopal Church's website and the Anglican Communion's website in your presentation. And we should remind people that there are great resources that are available on both of those websites, and in addition to others. But it's surprising the amount of information that's contained there.
Mm-hmm. I would encourage people to, and I hope I will share this with you. You can go back and look. I hope that Father Peter can arrange that in some way. But the Anglican Indigenous Network is running 4 different webinars in Advent. The first one's already happened, but I think you can find it on YouTube. The next 3 are about the Indigenous stewardship of their territories. Indigenous peoples know far more about the life functions of a territory than most of us more recent migrants do. And one of the significant ways in which we're going to heal this disaster, environmental disaster, is depending on the historical awareness of people in local contexts. The state of California, for example, is drawing on Indigenous communities' long history of working with fire to manage their environment in ways that will help reduce the impact of wildfires.
So, question about climate justice and the fact that those who already have the least are most impacted by the actions of more privileged folks when it comes to the climate, and if you can talk about how climate justice manifests itself, and specifically the problems with the U.S. Emitting more greenhouse gases than many other countries.
Mm-hmm. Well, the U.S. is experiencing that in spades. Look at the hurricanes on the southern and eastern coasts. Look at the wildfires in the West. Particularly look at Alaska. What's happening to Indigenous peoples in Alaska? They're not the people who've been pulling fossil fuels out of the earth. There is an ongoing struggle of decades in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where the Gwich'in people depend on caribou herds for their livelihood. The Gwich'in are, many of them are Episcopalians. And the church has been advocating on their behalf for decades to prevent further fossil fuel exploration and exploitation in the refuge that supports their food and their livelihood and their lifeways. The melting of ice in the Arctic is putting them in danger, is putting the Inuit in danger. The droughts in Africa are affecting the poorest and the those who are least able to grow crops without adequate rain. Everywhere you look, you can find evidence of climate injustice. And those who have caused the greatest destruction need to work hardest to alleviate and correct it.
A question about nuclear energy and the complications of that as an option, and if you have any thoughts.
I have some thoughts. I'm not sure I have a clear opinion. When I was in graduate school, I took a course in nuclear issues. It's been a very important way of producing power that's much cleaner than fossil fuels, but we haven't managed, obviously, the issue of what to do with the waste. There is ongoing work to recycle, repurpose, reuse what we have traditionally called waste in power generation, but we don't have a clear solution for that yet. Small nuclear plants appear to have more local ones appear to have better safety profiles than the massive ones that have been built in so many places, and may be very useful in local contexts like that. But we have a lot of scientific exploration yet to do in that regard. We've got lots of renewables. We've got boundless solar energy. We've got lots of wind capacity. We're developing ways to produce power from wave action and currents in the oceans, not just by damming rivers. We're also becoming much more effective in less destructively using hydropower on land. So we've got lots of alternatives.
And a greater awareness of the unintended consequences of some of the things that we have done. I know in Nevada, the sensitivity around where radioactive waste is stored is very immediate, because so much has been shipped to Nevada, I think, over the years.
Yes, and some of it surreptitiously in the last few years.
So we have a few follow-ups to previous questions. One points out that beyond just the human-centeredness, there's also an issue of self-centeredness, that it's not just about prioritizing human beings, but often people prioritize themselves. And there's a pretty direct line to draw between not leaving anything in the fields for the poor to come and gather and not wearing your mask to protect others. Can you talk a little bit about self-centeredness?
Well, I would invite the questioner to preach about that. Yes, we are all connected, and how we care for the whole community benefits all of us. I think that's the part that people don't understand, that the short-sightedness of selfishness. We think we're just taking care of ourselves. We're not. Our actions impact everyone around us, and ultimately the rest of the planet. Not wearing your mask means your children may get this disease. Your grandparents may get this disease. Your failing mother in the nursing home may get this disease. Care for those you love, and you will care for the whole world.
I remember hearing someone talking about the run on disinfectants, and someone said that if my hands are clean but no one else's hands can be, it doesn't really help anything. People stocking up the shopping cart.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to remember that when we're afraid, we're not in our best self. Fear drives a lot of these unhelpful actions. And if we can draw on our spiritual resources and our traditions, we are much more likely to make effective and creative and life-giving choices rather than destructive ones.
A final question asks if you can touch on the connection between climate change and immigration.
Yes, much of the anxious migration in the world today is the result of climate change, of the destruction that's already impacting people's lives. The horrendous mess in Syria is basically the result of drought. The inability to grow food, to produce adequate food for livelihood meant that people had to move. Bishop Wolf probably remembers the time when the House of Bishops met in Puerto Rico, and the bishop from Bangladesh was there. Bishop Baroy kept saying to us, "Save us from these curses," because of the flooding on the plains of Bangladesh, the flooding coming from stronger and more destructive storms. That was 15 years ago. Flooding in low-lying parts of the world, the inability to grow adequate food, the chaos that is driven in Central America from the same kinds of reasons is producing migration everywhere. People are trying to live in unlivable conditions.
Bishop Wolf, do you have a final question before we end?
Not so much a question, just an appreciation, Katharine, for the ministry that continues in you. We're so grateful for your sharing of these different ways of looking at things, and I think you will provoke some conversations in the future. We have a creation care task force that has done some work here, and we have a number of members of the congregation that are deeply committed to these issues. So this has been inspirational for them and for all of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a delight to speak with you, and I hope the conversations continue and ferment.
In another time, we'll hope to have you here in person. It'd be great. That can't be too far away.
No, I don't think it is. Pray for healing everywhere.
Thank you so much, Bishop Jefferts Schori. We're going to be posting some of the links we discussed today, the links to the webinar series, as well as a link to the water map of Manhattan so that you can take a look and see some of these things for yourself. We're so grateful to you for getting up early and being with us so early in the West, Bishop Jefferts Schori, and we're so grateful to all of you for watching. Please join us for worship at 11 a.m.
Thank you very much.